This playbook is all about giving feedback in a more structured way to make it meaningful and impactful for the person on the receiving end. It's called the CEDAR model, and it's one of my favorites. So let's dig in. The first part of the CEDAR model stands for context, introducing the importance of the feedback and the general domain that it's in, explaining the scope of the feedback and the desired outcome of the feedback conversation, really setting the context for this person to understand what's about to happen, what they're going to engage in, and what the desired results are going to be. So, for example, you might be sitting down with Sally to give her some feedback about participation in meetings in general because you're concerned that her voice isn't being fully captured and represented at the level of the team in certain types of conversations. So, just that amount of context can really set the stage for people to say, okay, we're talking about something specific, and I can wrap my head around that. Step number two is to give some examples to make it concrete. To say, yesterday in our brainstorming meeting, I realized that none of your ideas made it from the brainstorming session to up on the wall as possible as next steps. Or I didn't hear your voice when we were debating these two courses of action, right? So getting really clear about kind of when and where and what you're noticing. And maybe that's a behavior, or maybe that's a lack of a behavior, right? Someone not doing something you expect, but creating some, using enough examples, usually 1 to 3 examples is enough for us to say, okay, I understand the context and I understand more specifically what this conversation is about, or the kind of the start of this conversation is about these concrete examples. The third step is probably the most important piece of the CEDAR framework, which is diagnosis. And at this stage, it's really important that you don't offer your diagnosis. You don't say, I think you're not speaking up in these meetings because XYZ, right? What you want to do is say, based on this and these observations and these examples, what's happening for you? What do you think is getting in the way of you contributing in a meaningful way? Right. And create space. And this is where we shift into deep listening, and we invite the other person to offer an underlying reason or driver or why behind those examples. Okay? If we don't do this, if we offer our diagnosis first, the risk is that they're just going to nod their head and agree. We're going to move to the next phase, and we'll actually still be misaligned. We'll be missing each other. Okay? It doesn't mean that whatever their diagnosis is going to translate directly into the next action steps, but we want to surface it, right, so that we can negotiate. Because usually what happens with any given behavior, because we're part of a system and part of teams, is there's going to be underlying drivers. There's going to be a diagnosis for that individual, and they might say, you know what, I'm lacking some confidence in speaking up with this team, right? That's a them locus of control. It might also be that the facilitator of that meeting, maybe you, it doesn't create space for equal voices. And it might be that there's some team dynamics at play that are getting in the way. We want to surface a diagnosis at those different levels so that we can take action on them together, right? Sometimes what we land on is we see a behavior and we orient our feedback to that individual, and they have to fix only their thing, right? Or behave differently themselves, when the reality is that we as leaders are contributing to that, and so is the team. And so diagnosis is about exploring those underlying whys, surfacing any hidden insights that we're not aware of, and assessing, what might be required to move forward at different levels of the system. Once we get a good, accurate diagnosis that we agree on, we're going to work on, we move to action. What's the desired outcome? So the desired outcome might be more contribution to these brainstorming sessions. Very clear. We want to hear your voice, want to see your name on some proposals or some sticky notes or whatever it happens to be. Okay. Outline the required actions. So there's things that individual can do to take action. There's things that you as a leader can probably do, right? But getting really clear and concrete about the what, the how, the when, and the who, right? Really concrete next action steps, and agree that those are the things that we're going to practice or try together, but treat them as an experiment that we're going to review. So the last phase of the CEDAR model is about establishing a review and then completing that review. And depending on the behavior shift that we're after, usually we want a pretty short review window, because we want to practice at the next team meeting next week. We want to see these attempts at behavior, right? And what we can actually do is review right after that meeting, right? We can take 5 minutes and say, hey, that was better. Or, hey, same challenge. Maybe we need to rethink the action step here. Maybe there's something we're missing in the diagnosis, but we want to accelerate our feedback loops. We never want to wait and say, well, we'll revisit this at your annual employment review 6 months from now. Way too long. Right? So establish a really clear review window and review activities. At the very least, a 2 or 3 weeks out, we're going to sit down again for 15 minutes and we're going to talk about your participation and contribution in meetings to see if it's improved or if we're still kind of stuck in the same patterns of behavior. Okay, so that's the CEDAR model. I recommend as a prep activity before you head into a conversation is actually just sit down and get really clear, like write out the context, a couple bullet points, a couple of clear examples, and that's where you start. And you bring that to the table. And then again, really important, turn the diagnosis over initially to the other person to surface their perspective. You can always add your perspective and think, well, maybe this is contributing to it, right? To lead us to an agreement on that diagnosis so we can jump to establishing some shared actions, things that you can do and things that they can do to improve the situation. All right, so grab a copy of this. There's a CEDAR model template down in the bottom corner, and then some instructions as well below this video on how to use this model to make it most impactful for you and for your team members.